I think my particular perspective as someone who's had out-of-body experiences since I was around 12 years old has been a real journey to explore the different perspectives, both from the skeptical angle and from different areas like parapsychology and things like that, and to actually ask what is the evidence on either side, and what are out-of-body experiences, what could they suggest to us about who we are and how we function in the world. My first experiences didn't have anything that you could particularly say was veridical or was factual about the experience. So in the early experiences, I just made the assumption that maybe this was some kind of hallucination, etc. But then later on, the experiences started to include veridical elements or factual elements about the world around me. And that started to challenge my perception that these were just hallucinations. So I started to actively look into these kinds of areas and look at the different science, look at the different perspectives, both the perspective, for example, like we've heard, that uses virtual reality to create bodily illusions. Virtual reality is something I've worked with in quite a lot of depth. I've created virtual reality installations using full stereoscopic screens and a complete range of immersive technology. So I know exactly what virtual reality can do and how it can create a simulation of what you might call an out-of-body experience. You will experience things like vertigo, you will experience phobias. If you have a phobia of a particular creature and it's shown to you in the virtual reality space, you will have a reaction to it to some degree. But there is also an element that you'll understand that that's not real, and that you will be able to engage with it in a completely different way to if it was actually an experience of that, say, spider or whatever creature that you're working with. So when I looked into the kind of research that Jane does and Olaf Blank and people like that who have gained widespread press coverage for looking at this idea that there is this sense of self that's separated by using video cameras or some form of very basic virtual reality, it became apparent to me that we're dealing with something that's just a simulation, a trick of the mind, not something that's actually the same as what someone experiences when they have an out-of-body experience, which is a complete, complex, multi-leveled experience. It would also be a logical fallacy to conclude that because something appears to be the same, that it actually is the same, i.e. if I hallucinate that glass on the table, therefore glasses don't exist, which is kind of the argument with the out-of-body experience research. Then there's other research like the idea that the out-of-body experience relates to dysfunctioning in the brain. But again, the problem with a lot of this kind of research is the definition that it uses of an out-of-body experience can be very, very broad. Jason Braithwaite's research at the University of Birmingham used a definition from Sue Blackmore's research going back to 1981, which didn't define in any detail what exactly the people experiencing those OBEs were, what their history was, what exactly they were experiencing. There was no information within the context of that research. So again, it could include people who have a history of epilepsy, who have a history of drug use, things like that. I should outline, I've never used any form of hallucinogens, I haven't got any history of drug use at all. I don't have sleep paralysis, and my out-of-body experiences don't take place during the night. So that's another problem. Then I started to look into other veridical research and things out there, like prospective studies, like Penny Sartori's research in Wales that looked at the whole idea of the near-death experience over 5 years and found that people who have out-of-body experiences during the context of a cardiac arrest or within the context of being in a medical care unit will actually experience factual information about the world. They will relate things back. And this is not just anecdotal stories. This is when someone has actually, the details have been recorded right at the time that they've related them to the doctor or nurse on site. So this is not stuff that you can just say it's been elaborated over time or it's been altered or twisted. Even many of my own experiences that have been witnessed and verified were recorded within an hour at the most after the experience took place. So I find it very hard to dismiss the types of experiences I've had and the research that's out there. as the next stage in my wanting to understand this more, I contacted Rupert Sheldrake and I went and took part in some of his research and worked with him looking at things like the idea of the extended mind. Does the mind extend beyond the body? Is there a sense of that maybe the brain or consciousness in some way could be entangled or extended in some form? And looking at that research, actually taking part in that research and being on site, it seemed to me that the evidence shows that there is some form of extension with the mind. I'm not necessarily saying that consciousness is something that completely separates or is separate and acts outside the brain. I think that it's quite feasible that we could be dealing with something more like an extension, a signal, something that reaches beyond the brain. Maybe we're even dealing with something like a twin effect, that there's actually two senses of self. I don't think that consciousness is just a singular thing. It's just a ball of information or something that will separate or that won't in an out-of-body experience. I think we're dealing with multiple levels of perception, and maybe part of the out-of-body experience is a brain state, but then that is also related to some kind of external information that's coming into the brain. And maybe this is where Anthony's ideas around dimethyltryptamine and the idea of brain function on that level comes into play. So I think there's many areas that suggest that there is more going on than just the idea that we're dealing with some form of computation within the brain. I also think Michael Persinger, for example, who's very popular with skeptics, because when he puts the Coron helmet, which is a device that induces different states of awareness, senses of presence and things like are apparent in sleep paralysis, when he induces those kinds of things, it seems to show that these are just some kind of hallucination, etc., and there's nothing objective to it. But interestingly, Persinger doesn't think that. He thinks that the magnetic fields that he uses are actually facilitating some kind of psi or psychical perception at a distance.
Graham, can I ask you to wrap up? Is that
Okay.
Oh, you can conclude in around.
Well, to conclude, he's created a particular configuration called the octopus configuration, where he's shown a macro telepathic effect, i.e. he flashes a light into the eyes of participant A, and participant B's brain lights up as if they've seen the light. So that's